We now welcome Rami Mohammed.
Hello everyone, I thank you all for coming out today in support of Syria. We hope to publicly educate the people about the truth in regards to the current situation, and we hope for a peaceful resolution to the matter. It is important that we all know the truth and aim for peace in Syria once and for all. A dirty war is situated against Syria, which consists of mistruths, lies and misunderstanding. Countries such as the US, UK, Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Qatar and many others are to blame for the growing issues arising in Syria. They are responsible for the training and arming of thousands of terrorists, which are currently causing bloodshed to the government and its people. The actions of these terrorists do not indicate the want for peaceful change in Syria, as the killing of innocent civilians is not the answer to any reform. In the past 18 months, thousands upon thousands of civilians have been murdered, not due to the want for democracy or freedom, but have been killed due to terrorists that are interested in tearing up the government and those which agree with its reform. The basic human rights which are entitled to every single person are being blatantly abused by these terrorists, as their right to freedom of speech and safety have been taken away from them. The country's supply of electricity and water to the population has also been targeted. Oil pipelines have also been targeted and destroyed, which is making the use of everyday necessities which Syrians require harder to access. We are not disputing that the people of Syria want reform, but it is important that the want for change is demonstrated through peaceful and practical dialogue. Reform will not be achieved through foreign intervention and will most definitely not be achieved through the killing of innocent people. Did you know that only a couple of years ago, Syria was the 4th safest country in the world? At 12 o'clock at night, I would feel as safe as ever walking the streets with my family. We didn't feel any fear in Syria and felt a sense of security no matter where we went. Now we dare not to go due to the constant fear of being targeted. Only last week, these terrorists burnt down the old souk in Aleppo, which has been on the World Heritage Site registered by UNESCO since 1986. They want to enforce their own Islamic laws on the people of Syria, but destroying the country and its infrastructure will not bring any sort of reform to the country. It is important to remember the major role that the media is playing in the situation. Unfortunately, the majority of the media are telling blatant lies to misguide the whole of the Western world. We must all remember that the Syrian government is not responsible for the death of its own people, as the government only has the safety of its people at heart. The people of Syria which do not agree with their ideas of change are specifically being targeted by these terrorists. It is truly heartbreaking to know that a country that was once so peaceful is now being torn apart by the Gulf states and people of which only want to tear the people of Syria and its government apart. Many of us have been directly affected by this conflict due to the loss of close family members and friends. Please help us in promoting peace in Syria by the use of dialogue which demonstrates the want for change that does not involve the murder of thousands of innocent people. Syria's fragile state is due to the terrorists in Syria which believe that killing is the solution, and it has now come to a time where we all know that enough is enough. I hope that you will all acquire a large understanding on the crisis in Syria, and I hope that from the bottom of my heart that Syria is able to recover from its current state. We pray for peace for Syria, and God bless you all for attending. Thank you for listening.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming out today in support of Syria. All the speakers who have gone so far have made really good points. I'm going to elaborate on those a bit more, so bear with me, it might be a little bit longer. So what we're here today to do is to provide a different perspective on what is happening in Syria today, because so far in this country we're only hearing one side of the story, and there's an obvious agenda behind that side of the story. First I'll talk about my experiences in Syria. I was last in Syria in December in 2010, and I was able to travel to Homs, to Aleppo, to Damascus freely, safely, without fear, without being asked, what religious group are you from? What are your affiliations? Syria has been a country where Muslims and Christians, Arabs and Kurds all live side by side, and this has been the case for a long time, prior to 18 months ago. It's not to say Syria didn't face its challenges. As any developing nation, it had its issues. There were certainly economic issues faced by Syria that were being faced by the rest of the world as well. And there were genuine concerns. The poor in Syria had been suffering lately because of Syria's attempts to open up the economy to the world. And that had fueled legitimate concerns among some of the population in Syria. So how did it start? Well, as we've heard, there were peaceful protests in the beginning. There were young men and women, Syrians, out on the street calling for reform, and they had legitimate concerns. This was the same thing that was happening in Tunisia and Egypt, and it was happening in Syria as well. However, as we've seen in those other countries, these movements were hijacked by people who have agendas not at all related to achieving democracy or freedom. So the Syrian government, in response to these legitimate concerns, said, okay, we will begin reform. It suspended the decades-old emergency law, which stopped people congregating and protesting peacefully. It had a referendum on a new constitution, which the Syrian people voted on. And this new constitution granted the people greater freedoms. And it also held parliamentary elections. However, these reforms were never really given a chance. The opposition movement, as I said, was hijacked by people who do not want reform but wanted regime change. These are not the same people who were out on the streets protesting at the start. As we can see now, by looking at Egypt, looking at Tunisia, looking at Libya, the Arab Spring, which we're all happy to see, has now unfortunately turned into an Islamist summer. If we take Libya as an example, it is now under the control of an unelected force with various armed groups scattered across the country, establishing their own areas of control and committing crimes with impunity. This is not what we want for Syria. So as the movement was hijacked, the violence started, and the government responded as any other world government would to attacks on its own people and on its military. And unfortunately, as in any armed conflict, it is civilians who always pay the highest price. However, the rebels who claim to be protecting the civilians have time and time again chosen to take the fighting into the most heavily populated areas in Syria. They have fled to the densely packed cities of Homs, of Aleppo, of Damascus, and chosen to take the fighting there, endangering civilians. This is a tactic that's been condemned by the United States and its allies when its enemies have used it in the past. But no one has said anything about it this time around. So we've heard a lot about what the government has apparently done in the last 18 months. What about the rebels? A recent example, in Aleppo, a suicide bombing killed nearly 50 people and killed more than 100. And responsibility for this was claimed by Al Nusra group, which admits to being affiliated to Al Qaeda. This happened on the same day as the shelling from Syria that landed in Turkey. However, we have not heard nearly as much about the killing of 50 civilians and soldiers as we have heard about what happened in Turkey. This is not an isolated example. There have been dozens of documented cases of car bombings, suicide bombings throughout Syria, not only targeting the Syrian army, but civilian government buildings, TV stations, and even buses in central Damascus, killing civilians. 2 weeks ago, a bomb exploded at a school in Damascus. Now, you cannot say that that is a legitimate military target for the rebels to attack. What else have the rebels been doing? There have been many reports of abductions and ransoms throughout Syria, armed groups acting with impunity, able to pull over cars on the highways of Syria and kidnapping the passengers and holding them for ransom. The ransoms are often paid, but unfortunately the victims are not always released alive. Their bodies are often found dumped weeks later in different areas, and this is occurring on a regular basis in Syria. Assassinations have occurred in Syria of people who are thought to have a link to the government, and many of these are civilians who have no link to the military. The rebels have freely admitted to Western media that they often execute Syrian soldiers they capture. Unarmed, bound, and held by the rebels, they are often executed anyway. And we have seen evidence of this in videos released onto YouTube. Other videos have shown rebels throwing the bodies of civilian postal workers off a building in Aleppo, their only crime working for this government-affiliated service. Another video showed a man pulled from a car boot, bound and blindfolded, who then had his throat cut. His killers stating that this was the fate of all those who support the government. So who are these rebels? Well, the opposition is not one group. It has been oversimplified in the media. There is a non-violent opposition, but they are not the ones we are seeing active in Syria at the moment. The so-called Free Syrian Army is in fact made up of dozens of different militias, made up of some army deserters, some poor villagers, criminals from across Syria who now have a cause, and increasingly, as admitted by Western powers, more and more foreigners from outside Syria are now coming in. And what are these people motivated by? One thing: jihad. This is a term that has been hijacked by extremists to serve their own ends. They now think they are fighting a holy war in Syria. Jihadis from Libya, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Afghanistan, and even the United Kingdom and the US are now in Syria. And they have even had interviews with Western media outlets admitting this. Syria has now become a magnet for Islamic extremists from across the world. 2 Western journalists were recently taken hostage by a group of armed men in northern Syria. Those journalists, once they escaped, reported that they had met people from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Chechnya, and individuals who had very heavy British accents. Another Libyan rebel commander who recently fought against Gaddafi gave an interview to CNN, boasting how he was travelling to Syria with a group of his mercenaries fighting for jihad in Syria. Videos have now come out on YouTube showing masked men calling themselves the FSA, which you can see pictures of around here today. And in the background you can see the flag of Al-Qaeda hanging there. Al-Qaeda itself has released videos, including from Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda himself, calling for its fighters to join the struggle in Syria and praising the Syrian rebels.